Nightmare of Hinterkaifeck, the killer who stayed in the house after the murder. In the deep German countryside, in an isolated farmhouse, there was no witness and no scream was heard. 6 people were killed simultaneously with the same brutality, and the killer remained there with the corpses for 4 more days. This event went down in history as one of Europe's darkest and unsolved criminal cases. At the small Bavarian farmstead of Hinterkaifeck, Andreas Gruber lived with his wife, his widowed daughter, and his grandchildren, working his land. Although their life was thought to be quiet and ordinary due to its isolated location, as March 1922 approached, the farm increasingly became the scene of strange and disturbing events. Soon, the farm's 6 inhabitants would be found brutally slaughtered. This event became known in history as the Hinterkaifeck murders. Mysterious signs and rising tension. The Hinterkaifeck farm was built in 1863 and had been the Gruber family's property for many years. This small settlement, located about 70 kilometers from Munich, was situated in the deep countryside of the state of Bavaria. During the same period, the political and economic turmoil of the Weimar Republic had affected the region, creating a tense atmosphere. The farm's residents included the family patriarch, 63-year-old Andreas Gruber, his 72-year-old wife Cecilia, and their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel. Victoria had 2 young children with her, her 7-year-old daughter Cecilia and her 2-year-old son Joseph. The family consisted of 6 people in total, including a newly hired maid. Andreas Gruber was known to his family and neighbors for his harsh temperament and angry character. According to some sources, he allegedly abused his wife and children and threatened neighbors with a scythe, pitchfork, or shotgun. It was even said that he locked his children in the cellar for days during the winter. There were rumors that one of the family's previous children, Sophie, had died as a result of this abuse. In the weeks leading up to March 1922, strange events began to occur in and around Hinterkaifeck. 6 months earlier, the family's maid, Margret Schluter, had suddenly quit her job. Her reason was unusual: strange noises from the attic. She believed there was something at the farm and that the place was cursed. She even claimed the house was haunted. Andreas Gruber did not take these claims seriously and dropped the matter. But what was hiding within the silence had not yet revealed itself. In mid-March, Andreas Gruber found a newspaper from Munich. This was strange. He didn't remember buying the paper and initially believed the postman had delivered it to the wrong house. But no one in the area had a subscription. The postman also said he had not delivered it by mistake. The newspaper could have been the first silent sign that a stranger was inside the house. Soon after, something even more frightening happened. The house key mysteriously disappeared. The key vanished at a moment when everyone was thought to be home. Despite all these events, Gruber chose not to report it to the police. Just a few days before the murder, Andreas Gruber told his neighbors about human footprints in the snow. These tracks came from the forest towards the farm and ended directly at the broken lock of the machine shed door. That same night, family members reported hearing footsteps in the attic. Andreas searched the house but stated he found no one inside. The neighbors viewed the situation with concern and offered help, but Gruber, as usual, stubbornly refused. A classmate of little Cecilia Gabriel recounted another detail. On the night of Thursday, March 30th, Victoria had a big argument with her mother and father, fled the farm in anger, and was found hours later in the surrounding forest, exhausted and brought back. While the content of this argument is unknown, it was clear that family tensions had reached a peak. The dark night and the silent farm. On the afternoon of Friday, March 31st, 1922, a new maid arrived at the farm, Maria Baumgartner. She was a quiet, withdrawn woman. She had been brought by her sister, who had previously worked at the farm and left after a short time. This would be the last person to see Maria and the Gruber family alive. Maria's first day of work would also be her last. Late that same evening, the Gruber family was led out of the house one by one. Andreas, his wife Cecilia, his daughter Victoria, and his young granddaughter Cecilia. They were directed to the barn. There, the perpetrator or perpetrators, armed with a custom-made pickaxe from the farm, killed them by striking heavy blows to their heads. Then the killer entered the house. He killed 2-year-old Joseph, sleeping in his crib, and Maria Baumgartner, lying in her room, in the same manner. 6 people were silenced in a single night, and no one visited the house for 4 days. The bodies remained undiscovered. From the outside, the house was silent, but inside, something was still alive. On the morning of April 1st, 2 coffee salesmen, Hans Skarovsky and Eduard Skarovsky, came to the farm to deliver an order. They knocked on the door, tapped on the window, called out, but they received no response from inside. The only thing they noticed was that the machine shed door was open. They were suspicious but did not enter. They quietly left. Unknowingly, they had witnessed the house where one of Europe's darkest murders had taken place. The school of 7-year-old Cecilia Gabriel had become suspicious of her consecutive absences for several days. Similarly, neighbors noticed that the Gruber family had not attended the Sunday church service. It was clear something was wrong at the farm, but no one yet knew the magnitude of the truth. On the morning of April 4th, local repairman Albert Hoffner came to Hinterkaifeck to fix the farm's motor. However, when he knocked on the door, he got no response. In the yard, there was no sound except for animal noises from the barn and a dog howling inside. After waiting for Andreas Gruber for about an hour, and with no one appearing, he decided to repair the motor himself. The repair took about 4.5 hours. During this entire time, there was still no sign of human activity at the farm. Later that same afternoon, around 3:30 p.m., Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who had previously had close relations with the Gruber family, wanted to find out what was happening at the farm. He sent his 16-year-old son Johann and his 9-year-old stepson Joseph to the farm. The children returned shortly. "There's no one there," they said. The silence persisted. Lorenz Schlittenbauer could no longer remain indifferent to the situation. Later that day, he set out for Hinterkaifeck with Michael Pohl and Jacob Sigel. The 3 men opened the barn door and were met with a horrific scene upon entering. The bodies of Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, his daughter Victoria Gabriel, and his young granddaughter Cecilia were piled on top of each other. All had been killed by blows to the head with a pickaxe-like tool. Lorenz Schlittenbauer entered the farmhouse alone. He passed through the silent house and reached the bedroom. There, he encountered the lifeless bodies of the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, and 2-year-old Joseph, killed in his crib. They too had been killed in the same way, struck on the head with a pickaxe-like tool. 6 people, in a single night, with the same weapon. The investigation and disturbing findings. The investigation was assigned to Inspector George Reingruber and his team from the Munich Criminal Department. However, in the initial phase, the investigation was hampered in many ways. Numerous people who had entered the crime scene had inadvertently moved the bodies and items. Worse still, there were serious indications that the killer had continued to live in the house after the murders. The most disturbing finding was that the killer had indeed stayed at the farm after the murders. The animals had been fed, the stove had been lit, and food had been cooked in the kitchen. The calendar hanging on the wall showed the date April 1st, 1922. The victims had been killed on March 31st. This small detail showed the killer had remained in the house the next day. This could have been a daily habit, typically performed by the same person. The next day, the court physician, Dr. Baptista Smuller, performed the autopsies on the victims at the scene, in the barn. The most likely murder weapon was identified as a custom-made agricultural hoe. The sharp end of this tool was like a pickaxe. The other end was flat and curved. It wasn't designed directly for killing, but it killed. The autopsy findings were horrifying. 8 separate fractures were found in the skull of the mother, Cecilia Gruber. Victoria Gabriel's skull had 9 fractures. The magnitude of the impact showed the skull was almost shattered. Additionally, strangulation marks were found on Victoria's neck. As if the pickaxe alone wasn't enough, she also seemed to have been strangled. Little Cecilia Gabriel had a large pickaxe wound on the right side of her face. It is thought she survived for a while before the attack because her body was found half naked. This detail raised strong suspicion that the perpetrator had not only killed her but had assaulted her beforehand. During this process, Cecilia had torn her own hair out in clumps. The hair strands in her palms were silent witnesses to this horror. The killer used a rusty metal band hidden in the hayloft to silence her. The young girl's jaw was shattered by this blow. But the fatal strike was a knife plunged into her throat. This cut tore her throat from end to end. Unlike the other family members, Andreas Gruber received only a single fatal blow. Falling onto the straw, the point of a heavy pickaxe had torn his carotid artery. The flesh on his right cheek was torn, and his cheekbone was exposed. Either he had stumbled and fallen, or someone had pushed him. His body was found in front of the animal trough. The killer had covered the bodies, some with straw, others with a wooden lid. Perhaps he was trying to hide the traces, or perhaps he just didn't want to see them. Inside the house, Maria Baumgartner had died from a hard blow to her head. The right side of her face was shattered. There was a large depression in the top of her skull. At least one deep fracture was identified. Little Joseph Gabriel had died in his crib. He was killed by a single powerful blow to the right side of his skull. Such brutality against a child of that age was proof of how the killer had become a monster. The murder weapon was not found in the initial searches. However, the autopsy revealed that the most likely weapon was an agricultural hoe. One end of the hoe was like a pickaxe. The other end was sharp and curved. This weapon was not made directly for killing, but the person using it had designed it as such. Meanwhile, the police investigation was expanding. A farmer and butcher named Simon Riedel reported that while returning home around 3 a.m. on April 1st, he had seen two people on the edge of the forest near Brunnen. When the strangers noticed him, they quickly turned their backs, avoiding showing their faces. After hearing about the Hinterkaifeck murders days later, he thought the people he saw that night could be the perpetrators. Initially, the police thought this horrific attack might have been a robbery. Therefore, traveling craftsmen, vagrants, and some suspicious individuals from surrounding villages were questioned. One of those questioned was Michael Plockel, who had passed by Hinterkaifeck 3 days before the bodies were found, on the night of the murder. Plockel stated he had noticed the farmhouse's oven was on that night. In the darkness, he said someone approached him with a lantern. His eyes were suddenly dazzled, and they quickly moved away before he could see what happened. The smell of smoke rising from the oven was indescribably bad. To him, it smelled like burning rags or rotten meat. He reported this statement officially to the police but was never taken seriously. No official investigation was conducted into what was burned in the oven that night. Perhaps not only evidence of the crime but also the victim's traces were being destroyed there. The direction of the investigation changed when a large amount of money was found in the house. The possibility of theft was eliminated. On the contrary, evidence in the house showed the killer had lived inside for several days. The animals had been fed. All the bread in the kitchen had been consumed, and meat had been cut from the pantry. Life had continued inside the house, right beside the 6 corpses. In more thorough searches, the killer's weapon was found, hidden inside a false ceiling panel in a kitchen cavity. It was a custom-made pickaxe, 80 centimeters long. It was a tool personally developed by Andreas Gruber for slaughtering cattle. It had a blade-like part fixed at the tip with an 8mm threaded screw. When struck with the back of the tool, it was designed to cause brain damage in animals. The same tool was now in a killer's hand, and this time the victims were people. During their examination of the house, the police found another disturbing discovery in the attic. There were numerous signs that someone had stayed there for a long time. Some boards had been removed for observation purposes. Rugs had been laid on the floor to muffle footsteps. Ropes were tied to various beams in the ceiling. This was a system that would allow the killer to escape quickly if someone entered the house or barn. Even fecal traces and smoked food remnants were found in the hayloft. The killer hadn't just been hiding, he had been living there. 4 days, maybe even weeks. And during this time, he had been watching the house. Silently, patiently, in the darkness of the night. Yet despite all this evidence, the police still had no clue to definitively identify the killer. Consequently, the Munich Criminal Department decided to create a detailed list of suspects. Every clue had to be evaluated, every shadow questioned. Because now there was only one truth. The perpetrator was either an insider or knew how to act like one perfectly. Suspects and unsolved secrets. One of the first theories put forward after the murders involved Victoria Gabriel's husband, Carl Gabriel, who had died years earlier. Gabriel had been reported killed by an artillery shell in Arras, France, in December 1914 during World War I, but his body had never been found. This uncertainty, combined with the 1922 murders, spawned new rumors. What if Karl never died? Victoria had given birth to a child after her husband's death, Joseph. However, according to some sources, rumors echoed throughout the village that the child's father was not Karl, but was the result of an incestuous relationship between Victoria and her own father, Andreas Gruber. These allegations had also reached the courts. It was reported that Andreas Gruber had served prison time for rape. At the time, there was no evidence that Gabriel had survived World War I. However, after the war ended, German prisoners from the Schrobenhausen area, who were released early from Soviet captivity, claimed they had been sent home by a German-speaking Soviet officer. A strong theory emerged that the German-speaking Soviet officer could be Karl Gabriel, because there were people who claimed to have seen him after his death was reported. Shortly after the Hinterkaifeck murders, people began to speculate about whether he had really died in the war. They claimed he was the Hinterkaifeck killer. Some people who had known him previously also said that Gabriel had not died in the war and had planned to go to Russia. However, the credibility of these testimonies weakened over time, and the theory was never proven. The most controversial figure in Hinterkaifeck was undoubtedly Lorenz Schlittenbauer. The man who first arrived at the farm and discovered the bodies was also Victoria Gabriel's neighbor and probable former lover. In fact, many believed that Joseph's real father was not Andreas Gruber, but Lorenz Schlittenbauer. It was also known that Victoria had asked him for financial support. On the day of the murder, when Lorenz Schlittenbauer and his two friends arrived at the farm, all the doors were locked. But immediately after finding the 4 bodies in the barn, Lorenz Schlittenbauer opened the house door with a key and entered alone. However, the key had gone missing before the murders. Although it was suggested he might have been given a key due to his relationship with Victoria, his entry into the house alone in the heat of the moment aroused suspicion. More importantly, Lorenz Schlittenbauer disclosed details about the inside of the house that only the killer could have known. Details such as the locations of the bodies, how they were killed, and specifically that the killer wanted to bury the bodies in the barn but the frozen ground prevented it, raised questions about him. He made this statement to a teacher while walking through the demolished farm ruins in 1925. Even though 3 years had passed since the event, his clear recollection of the ground's condition led to him being kept under observation. Lorenz Schlittenbauer filed many lawsuits against his accusers over the years and won most of them. But he could never free himself from the ghost of Hinterkaifeck. Even if he wasn't truly guilty, he perhaps took whatever he knew behind this veil of secrecy to his grave. Another claim put forward years later linked the Hinterkaifeck murders to other massacres outside Germany. American author Bill James, in his book, The Man from the Train, argued that a series of unsolved axe murders committed in America in the late 1800s and early 1900s could be the work of the same person. According to James, this killer was a German immigrant named Paul Müller. The pattern Müller followed was chilling. Families living in remote, isolated homes were slaughtered with an axe at night. Bodies were moved and piled up. No valuables were stolen. In other words, it wasn't robbery, but a fully planned execution. Müller was thought to have used train tracks to flee from city to city after the murders in America and was never caught. The similarities with the Hinterkaifeck murders were striking. A farm tool similar to an axe, an isolated home, a nighttime massacre, the killer remaining inside, the feeding of animals, the absence of robbery. All this raised the suspicion that Paul Müller might have returned to Germany and continued the same murder pattern there. The most striking parallel was the 1912 Villisca axe murders in Iowa. An entire family had been killed in the same way, struck in the head with an axe. Conclusion: a never-solved mystery. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of the most mysterious and disturbing events in German criminal history. 6 people, a family of 3 generations and their maid, were systematically slaughtered in their own home on a silent night. Yet, nearly a century after the investigation began, not a single definitive perpetrator has been found. Why? The first reason was the highly conscious nature of the crime. The killer or killers didn't just kill, they also knew how to avoid leaving traces. They hid the bodies, concealed the weapon, stayed in the house, and even fed the animals. The crime scene had been professionally manipulated. This level of cold-bloodedness and control pointed more towards a calculated plan than an ordinary fit of rage. The second reason was that the investigation itself was flawed from the start. Most of the evidence was either destroyed or not properly recorded. When villagers, journalists, and the curious entered the crime scene, the murder site turned from a place of crime into a public spectacle. In those years, forensic science was still in its infancy. Technologies like fingerprinting, DNA, or ballistic matching didn't exist yet. The only hope lay in witness statements and physical observations, which were full of contradictions. The third reason was the inability to establish a clear chain of motivation among the suspects. The Karl Gabriel theory was lost in the dark fog of war. Lorenz Schlittenbauer may not have been a killer, but he certainly exhibited suspicious behavior. The Paul Mueller theory was built on another continent and another history. Each was plausible, but none were concrete enough. The fourth reason was the silence of the community. The incest rumors surrounding Hinterkaifeck, the domestic violence, the village's silent morality. Everyone seemed to know something, but no one wanted to talk. Victoria's voice in the church choir may have been loud, but the town's conscience was silent. In conclusion, the Hinterkaifeck murders were not just a picture of 6 people, but a bleak photograph of an era. Silence, fear, stigma, social pressure, the traumas left by the war. All converged on the same night, at the same farm, under the shadow of the same axe. And perhaps the real killer wasn't just one of the people. Perhaps the killer was the era itself, that dark, gray, fragmented Germany. A footstep echoing in a silent field, a shadow prowling in the attic in the dead of night, and 6 lives that would never return. The perpetrator was never found, but the questions remain. Why that family? Why that method? And who was so cold-blooded? All that remains is an empty farm, 6 graves, and a silence that will never cease.